So instead we turn to former London Mayor Ken Livingstone for his Take of the Week.
Why is Gordon Brown doing so well and the Tories all over the place? The simple fact is we're facing an economic crisis that we really haven't seen since before the war. And this is a vast crisis. The world hasn't really seen deflation other than in Japan since before the Second World War. And the problem for Japan, once they got into deflation, falling prices, wage cuts, prices going down so people put off purchasing things, is getting out of it. Might take over a decade. So when Brown says we will borrow money to tax cuts, to get people to spend more, to keep people in work through public spending and so on, that actually shows the scale of the crisis we've got. One good thing to come out of this is after a long period of time in which Tony Blair broadly accepted the Thatcher-Reagan agenda of not increasing taxes on the rich and so on, we're now back to a clear and very direct choice between the two parties, with Gordon Brown advocating tax cuts, the Tories saying we can't afford them. And I don't know whether that's because the Tories are just playing politics with this, having to be oppositionists, or whether they don't understand the real significance of the crisis the world faces, that we could be on the brink of a decade-long depression. In a crisis like this, where a strong government looks like it knows where it's going, there's really no traction the opposition can get. My advice to Cameron Osborne is basically just echo what the government's doing, keep your mouth shut, and wait for this period to pass. Again and again in my career, when people thought I was doomed, I just hunkered down and waited till my opponents screwed up, and I survived. This week's 3% Tory lead in the Mori poll, I think, indicates that Gordon Brown has clearly emerged from this whole crisis very strongly. He knows what he's doing, he knows where he wants to go. The only issue will be, once the crisis is over, once the new structures are in place, will people forget, will a Tory lead emerge as we get into a long drawn-out recession next year? But I still think there's a very good chance that by the time you get to the next general election, because of what Gordon Brown has done in this crisis and how poor Cameron and Osborne have looked in response to it, there's a real chance that Gordon Brown will actually win his own mandate at the next general election.
That was Ken Livingstone. Believe it or not, what was once his seat of power, County Hall, is now a rather smart recording studio. And here he is, by the magic of television, in our very smart recording studio.
Nice to be here.
Live. Good to see you, Ken. Now, let me come to you, Michael. We heard what Ken had to say there. How big a deal is this? We've been calling it the pre-budget report on Monday. It's actually a budget on Monday, by any other name. How big a deal is it?
It's a big deal. It's the battle lines for the next election. And, you know, Ken put his finger on it. It's this extraordinary situation now where Labour is proposing to cut taxes and the Conservatives are saying that that would be fiscally irresponsible. And it seems to me that both sides are taking an enormous risk. I mean, it's quite exciting politically, because for a Prime Minister who's in the middle of an economic catastrophe and who's borrowed a great deal of money to say we must borrow much more, and I'm going to give you tax cuts, risks looking like a pretty obvious attempt to buy the election. On the other hand, for the Tories going to the election promising fiscal responsibility isn't just the most exciting electoral slogan that you could possibly think of.
Because it's not quite clear what it means anyway, to most people.
Well, I mean, the Tories, of course, have wanted to be different from what people have thought them to be in the past. And in the past, they were regarded as knee-jerk tax cutters, which meant, in most people's minds, that they were knee-jerk public spending cutters. And they want to avoid being in that situation. But, I mean, what has been transformed in this situation is that the Tories, in one general election after another, were caught on the horns of this dilemma. That they either went with Labour on its public spending plans, in which case the Conservatives weren't being conservative, or they went for a lower figure than the Labour Party, in which case they had to explain what they were going to cut. And it looked like this time they wouldn't be in that quandary, but they are in that quandary again, because Gordon Brown has felt liberated by this economic catastrophe to throw caution to the wind and advocate profligacy.
Diane, is this budget on Monday as big a deal as Michael says, that it will set the dividing lines, the battle lines for the next election?
Oh, I think that's right. And also, Gordon came out of the G20 with cover, if you like, with these tax cuts and all this public spending, because the G20 seemed to be saying that everyone should be doing that.
Including the IMF as well.
Including that.
Ken, you've not always been noted to be Mr. Brown's greatest cheerleader. What's changed?
Well, I think that the policies that the Labour government started with were very wrong indeed. They maintained the Tory spending cuts. They didn't, go for higher taxes on the higher paid. And I think at that first 2 or 3 years, I was most probably a stronger critic than the Tory benches were. I think, though, what you're going through now is affecting much more significant than just an economic crisis. I think you really got to say the Thatcher-Reagan philosophy, which has dominated politics for almost 3 decades, has run its course. We're not going to go back to the 70s or the post-war consensus, but something closer
something
to that.
Different
Yeah, something different. And Obama's election, Obama's won the election really on the back of this crisis. He will be making major changes. And if all the world is broadly going in that direction, and the Tories have been completely discordant and saying, no, we must hunker down, lots of cuts, and so on, then I think they could actually find themselves just throwing the next election away.
But do
You glide very easily from one thing to another, from one thing to
my reptilian nature.
From one thing to its opposite, because you say that you were against Labour in the early days because it wasn't increasing taxes on the rich, and then you say in your little film, and now we've got a clear choice, Labour's cutting taxes and the Tories are not. But that is the opposite of what you've always thought the Labour Party should do. It's the opposite of what you always did. You always raised taxes.
I always wanted taxes raised on well-off people like us. I always thought we should be cutting taxes on the big boys. When I started work 40 years ago, the average person barely paid any income tax at all. Gradually, with every decade, it started catching more and more people.
And do you think Gordon Brown on Monday is going to raise taxes on rich people?
No, I regret he won't. But what I want to see, and what I very much hope, is that these tax cuts will be concentrated on low-income and middle-class families, so they will spend the money.
But Diane, do you agree with Ken that this isn't just Gordon Brown doing quite well because he's playing on his wicket, the economy, fiscal responsibility, or whatever, that he's changed politically? Do you believe that?
Surely Ken isn't actually saying that.
Well, I think he
There's
is.
one thing about...
I'm saying he's changed. I'm saying he's responding to a very different world that we now go and live in.
And will preside over a different kind of... in your view, you think he may well preside over something that will replace the Reagan-Thatcher consensus.
Reagan-Thatcher
was part of the Reagan-Thatcher consensus.
And that was the tragedy. But the moment John Smith was dead, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown signed up to that consensus.
So that means he is changing.
I think Ken's sunny optimism is very endearing. But I haven't noticed in 20 years in Parliament that Gordon is that flexible. I mean, he's responding to very different circumstances.
No, but you're not being flexible.
For that, we can be grateful.
You're not being flexible. You have a set idea of what Gordon Brown is, and you're not responding to how different he is now. I think he is changing.
In what way do you think he's different?
Well, I think he's changing politically, but even more importantly, I think he's changing temperamentally. The fellow of October 2007 was the person who couldn't bring himself to decide on a general election. This man is now taking so many risks every day. He's making 6 risky decisions before breakfast every day. Completely different temperament.
Well, yes, let me ask you then, if he's taking risky decisions, should one of them be that he calls a quick election?
No, I think people would think that's a bit of a con. I think if we can go through the recession we're going to have and be coming out of that at the next general
By
election,
the spring of 2010,
by the spring
you think he should go for the duration of the Parliament?
I think go down to May 2010, demonstrate this isn't just a gimmick to win an election, but we're going to come through this recession and we'll be hitting into growth in 2020.
Do you agree with that, Diane?
Yeah, I think Labour MPs think that spring would be too early, but there is a consensus around the autumn. And what I will say...
Hold on, a consensus
Well,
that we should go next autumn?
No. Consensus is too strong a word, but people are talking about next autumn. There's always a danger of going right up to the wire.
But if people are talking about that, then there is a danger that we will go right back to the autumn of last year and